Sarah Chen adjusted her worn cleaning uniform for the 100th time as she stood in the massive reception hall of the Zephyrian Royal Palace. The crystalline walls stretched impossibly high above her, refracting light from 3 different suns into dancing rainbows that made her human eyes water. She clutched her employment documents tighter, trying not to think about how desperate she had been when she applied for this position. Earth was dying. The environmental collapse had accelerated beyond all projections, and the few remaining habitable zones were overcrowded with refugees. When the Galactic Employment Bureau opened applications for domestic positions on alien worlds, Sarah hadn't hesitated. Her doctorate in xenobiology meant nothing when there were no labs left to work in, and her savings had run out months ago. A maid's position on Zephyr Prime seemed like salvation, even if it meant leaving behind everything she had ever known. The other applicants around her were an impressive mix of species. Tall, blue-skinned Altarians with their forearms would certainly be more efficient at cleaning. The rock-like granite people could work for days without rest. Even the insectoid hivespawn seemed better suited for detailed work with their multiple appendages. Sarah wondered what she, a baseline human, could possibly offer that these beings couldn't do better. Sarah Chen, human designation Earth 7749 Delta, announced a melodious voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Sarah stepped forward, her heart pounding. A shimmering portal opened before her, and she walked through into a smaller chamber where a figure waited. The being before her was unmistakably Zephyrian, tall and elegant with skin that shifted between silver and gold like liquid metal. Their features were androgynous and beautiful in a way that made humans uncomfortable, as if looking at something too perfect to be real. "I am Coordinator HFY," the being said, their voice carrying harmonics that human ears weren't designed to process. "You are here for the domestic service position." "Yes, honored Coordinator," Sarah replied, remembering the cultural briefing she had memorized. "I understand the position involves maintaining royal quarters and performing household duties." HFY's large, opalescent eyes studied her with an intensity that made Sarah feel transparent. "Your qualifications are unusual. A xenobiology doctorate, field research experience on 17 different worlds, published papers on interspecies communication protocols. Why do you seek employment as domestic staff?" The question hit harder than Sarah expected. She had prepared for this, but, standing here in this alien palace, the reality of her situation crashed over her again. "My world is dying," she said simply. "My field of study has become irrelevant when there's nowhere left to study. I need work, and I'm not too proud to start over." Something shifted in HFY's expression, though Sarah couldn't read the alien emotions. The Zephyrian royal family values unique perspectives. "Your position, should you be selected, would involve serving in the private quarters of Queen Lyralii herself. The work is demanding, the hours unpredictable, and absolute discretion is required." "I understand," Sarah nodded. "Do you?" HFY moved closer, and Sarah caught a scent like ozone and flowers. "The Queen is particular about her staff. Humans are not typically chosen for such positions. Your species is considered too unpredictable, too emotional. Yet your application intrigued her." Sarah's mind raced. Something felt off about this entire interaction. "May I ask why?" "You may ask," HFY replied with what might have been amusement. "The Queen will answer your questions herself, should she choose to employ you." The coordinator gestured, and the air shimmered. A uniform materialized, not the rough servant's clothing Sarah had expected, but something elegant and fitted, made from fabric that seemed to shift color like Zephyrian skin. "Put this on. You will be given a trial period starting immediately." Sarah's hands shook slightly as she took the uniform. "A trial period? What about the other applicants?" "There are no other applicants being considered at this time." The implications of that statement sent a chill down Sarah's spine. As HFY led her through corridors that seemed to reorganize themselves with each step, she began to realize that she might not have applied for this job at all, she might have been recruited. The Queen's private wing was a marvel of architecture that defied human understanding. Walls curved in impossible angles, and rooms existed in spaces that seemed larger inside than outside. Gardens grew in mid-air, their roots extending into dimensional pockets. Sarah tried to memorize the layout, but quickly gave up as passages rearranged themselves around her. Her Majesty's chambers, HFY announced, stopping before doors that looked like they were carved from a single massive pearl. You will begin with basic organization and cleaning duties. The Queen values privacy above all else. You will see nothing, hear nothing, and speak to no one about what you observe here. Sarah nodded, though unease gnawed at her. Every instinct developed during years of xenobiological fieldwork was screaming that this situation was not what it appeared to be. The doors opened with a soft musical tone, revealing a suite of rooms that took Sarah's breath away. The central chamber featured a living ceiling, not decorated with paintings, but actually alive with bioluminescent organisms that created patterns of light and shadow. Furniture grew from the floor like crystalline trees, and the air itself seemed to sparkle with energy. Your Majesty, HFY spoke to the seemingly empty room. The new domestic staff member has arrived. Movement in Sarah's peripheral vision caught her attention. Queen Lyralii emerged from what Sarah had thought was a decorative alcove, and the human woman had to suppress a gasp. The Queen was stunning in a way that went beyond mere physical beauty. Her skin held the signature Zephyrian metallic sheen, but with a depth that suggested hidden complexity. She was tall, even for her species, with features that seemed to have been crafted by an artist who understood the mathematics of perfection. But it was her eyes that made Sarah's breath catch. They were ancient and intelligent, holding depths of knowledge and experience that seemed impossible for any single being to contain. When the Queen looked at her, Sarah felt as though she was being analyzed at a molecular level. Thank you, HFY. You may leave us. The coordinator bowed deeply and departed through a door that Sarah was certain hadn't been there moments before. Queen Lyralii approached with fluid grace, studying Sarah with those unsettling eyes. Dr. Sarah Chen. Your reputation precedes you. Your Majesty, I think there may be some mistake. I'm just here for a domestic position. The Queen's laughter was like crystal bells chiming in harmony. Oh, my dear human, you are here for far more than that. Tell me, what do you know of the Convergence War? Sarah's blood ran cold. The Convergence War was classified information, known only to the highest levels of galactic government. It was rumored to be a conflict not between species, but between dimensional entities that viewed organic life as an inconvenience to be eliminated. I don't understand how that relates to everything relates to the Convergence War, Queen Lyralii interrupted. Including why a brilliant xenobiologist with expertise in interspecies communication is now standing in my private chambers, supposedly applying for work as a maid. The Queen moved to what appeared to be a wall, touching it with one elegant finger. The surface became transparent, revealing a view of space that shouldn't have been possible from inside the palace. Ships moved in formations that Sarah recognized as military patterns, but their designs were unlike anything she had seen before. The Zephyrian Empire stands at a crossroads, the Queen continued. Our ancient enemies move in the spaces between dimensions, preparing for a war that will determine the fate of all organic life in this galaxy. Traditional military might will not be sufficient to defeat them. Sarah's mind reeled. Your Majesty, I'm honored by your confidence, but I don't understand why you're telling me this. Queen Lyralii turned back to her, and, for a moment, her perfect composure slipped, revealing something desperate beneath. Because, Dr. Chen, you and your species represent something unique in the galaxy. Something our enemies cannot predict or counter. I don't follow. Humanity's capacity for unpredictability, for making impossible choices under pressure, for adapting to circumstances that would paralyze other species, these are not weaknesses. They are weapons. The Queen gestured to the floating gardens around them. Every other species in the galaxy follows patterns, even in their rebellions and innovations. Their thoughts flow in predictable channels, their strategies follow logical progressions. The convergence entities have studied us for millennia. They know how we think, how we fight, how we react to their tactics. Sarah felt a terrible understanding beginning to dawn. But they don't know how humans think. Precisely. Your species has been in galactic society for less than 2 centuries. You're still largely unknown quantities, especially individuals with your background and capabilities. The queen approached a pedestal that held what looked like a complex crystalline device. As she touched it, holographic displays filled the air around them, showing star maps, tactical readouts, and information that made Sarah's xenobiology background suddenly seem very relevant indeed.
This is not a maid's position you've accepted, Dr. Chen. This is recruitment into the most classified operation in galactic history.
A mission that requires someone who can think in ways our enemies cannot anticipate, someone who can adapt to situations that would break others, someone who can make the impossible choices that may be necessary to save us all. Sarah stared at the displays, recognizing stellar cartography mixed with what appeared to be dimensional mathematics beyond her understanding.
And, if I refuse? Queen Lyreliai's expression became unreadable.
Then, you return to your duties as domestic staff, with your memory of this conversation carefully edited. You live out your employment contract in comfort and ignorance while the galaxy burns around you. The weight of the choice pressed down on Sarah like gravity from a massive world. Everything she had believed about her situation, about her desperate escape from Earth, about her random selection for this position, all of it had been orchestrated.
But, why her? What could one human xenobiologist do against interdimensional entities that threatened all organic life? What exactly would this mission involve?
Initially, you would continue your role as domestic staff. It provides perfect cover for your real work, gathering intelligence, making contact with assets, and preparing for operations that haven't been planned yet because we don't know what form the convergence threat will ultimately take. The Queen moved to another section of the chamber, where what appeared to be living artwork covered the walls. As Sarah looked closer, she realized the patterns were actually complex data streams, information flowing in visual form that somehow conveyed meaning directly to her brain. The convergence entities exist partially outside normal spacetime, Queen Lyreliai explained. They can predict the actions of species they've observed for millennia, but humanity represents a variable they haven't accounted for. Your unpredictability isn't just useful, it's essential. Sarah thought of Earth, dying and overcrowded, its people scattered across the galaxy as refugees and laborers. She thought of her research into interspecies communication, how it had taught her that every species had unique ways of processing reality. If the Queen was right, if humanity's chaotic nature could somehow be turned into an advantage against an impossible enemy. What guarantee do I have that this isn't just an elaborate way to manipulate me into espionage work? The Queen's smile was sad and knowing. None. You'll have to trust me, just as I'm trusting you with information that could start wars if it fell into the wrong hands. Sarah looked around the chamber again, seeing it now with different eyes. The living walls, the impossible geometry, the casual display of technology that redefined what she thought possible, this wasn't just a royal residence. This was a command center, disguised as luxury. The other applicants, she said suddenly.
There never were any, were there?
Oh,
there were applicants.
Hundreds of them, all carefully vetted and, all ultimately rejected. You were selected before you even knew this position existed. The implications of that statement settled over Sarah like a cold blanket.
How long have you been watching me?
Long enough to know that you're the right person for this task. Your psychological profile, your adaptability, your expertise, everything points to you being uniquely suited for what we need. Queen Lyreliai gestured, and the holographic displays shifted to show personnel files. Sarah recognized her own image among dozens of others, all humans, all with similar academic backgrounds, all apparently being evaluated for something far beyond domestic service. The convergence war has already begun, the Queen said quietly. The first battles are being fought in dimensions you can't perceive, by entities using weapons that rewrite the fundamental laws of physics. Our conventional forces are being systematically neutralized by enemies who can predict their every move. Sarah studied the tactical displays, her xenobiology training helping her understand the scope of what she was seeing.
How much time do we have?
That depends on how quickly we can develop new strategies.
Strategies that require minds that think differently than any of ours. The choice crystallized in Sarah's mind.
She could return to her simple life as a maid, safe in ignorance while the galaxy faced an existential threat. Or she could step into something far more dangerous, but potentially crucial to the survival of every organic species in the galaxy. She thought of her home world,
slowly suffocating under the weight of environmental collapse. She thought of humanity scattered across the stars, seen as refugees and second-class citizens by more established species. This could be their chance to prove their worth, to contribute something meaningful to galactic civilization.
I accept, she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Queen Lyraliai's expression showed what might have been relief. I hoped you would. Your training begins immediately, though to anyone observing, you're simply learning your duties as domestic staff.
What kind of training?
Combat, intelligence gathering, xenobiology applications you never learned in university, and, most importantly, how to think like a weapon that our enemies cannot predict. The Queen touched another control, and a section of the floor opened to reveal a staircase leading downward.
Welcome to Operation Mindbreak, Dr. Chen. Let's see if human unpredictability can save the galaxy.
As Sarah followed Queen Lyraliai down the hidden staircase, she realized her life had just taken a turn that would have been impossible to predict. Behind them, the domestic quarters maintained their illusion of peaceful luxury, while below them lay secrets that could change everything. The real question wasn't whether she could handle the truth about her situation, it was whether the galaxy was ready for what humanity might be capable of when properly motivated. The convergence entities had studied every other species for millennia, but they had never encountered humans operating at full potential. That, Sarah thought as they descended into the hidden levels of the palace, was about to change. The hidden levels beneath Queen Lyraliai's chambers were unlike anything Sarah had imagined possible. As they descended the crystalline staircase, the walls around them shifted from organic curves to angular geometric patterns that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. The air itself felt different here, charged with energy that made her skin tingle and her mind sharper. The palace exists in multiple dimensional layers, Queen Lyraliai explained as they walked through corridors that shouldn't have fit within the building's footprint. What you see above is merely the public face. This is where the real work happens. They emerged into a vast chamber that defied architectural logic. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, lost in shadows that moved with their own purpose. Workstations were scattered throughout the space, each one surrounded by holographic displays showing data streams that hurt to look at directly. Beings of various species worked at terminals, their movements precise and focused. Welcome to the Nexus, the Queen said. Command Center for Operation Mindbreak, though most of our personnel believe they're working on routine intelligence analysis for the Ministry of Xenological Affairs. Sarah noticed that several of the workers were human, which surprised her.
How many of us are involved in this?
Fewer than you might think, more than our enemies suspect.
Each human asset is compartmentalized, working on specific aspects without knowing the full scope.
You're the first to be brought into complete operational awareness. As they moved deeper into the facility, Sarah saw workstations dedicated to analysis she recognized from her academic background: xenobiological patterns, interspecies communication matrices, behavioral prediction algorithms. But there were also stations showing things that made no sense, equations that seemed to describe spaces that couldn't exist, energy patterns that defied known physics, and, most disturbing of all, what appeared to be live feeds from locations that looked nothing like anywhere in normal space. The convergence entities, Queen Lyraliai said, noticing Sarah's focus on those particular displays. They exist partially in what we call fold space, dimensions that intersect with ours but follow different rules.
Traditional observation methods don't work there, which is why we've had to develop new approaches.
They stopped at a workstation where a being Sarah didn't recognize was manipulating 3-dimensional data structures with 6-fingered hands. The creature looked up as they approached. Its face was a disturbing blend of features from multiple species, as if someone had tried to create a universal template for intelligence.
Dr. Chen, Queen Lyraliai said, neat synthesis, our chief analyst for convergence behavior patterns.
Synthesis spoke in a voice that sounded like multiple people talking in harmony.
The human arrives at a fortuitous moment.
We have detected new patterns in entity movement that correlate with dimensional disturbances near several populated systems. Sarah studied the data display, her xenobiology background helping her parse what she was seeing. These look like migration patterns, but the scale is enormous.
What exactly are these entities?
That, said Synthesis, is the question that has consumed our research for 3 centuries.
They appear to be collective intelligences that exist across multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously.
Individual entities are approximately the size of small moons, but they function as components of larger meta-organisms that span entire galactic regions. The implications made Sarah's head spin.
You're talking about single life forms that exist on a galactic scale? Not life forms as we understand them, Queen Lyralii corrected. Something else entirely.
They consume organized information, civilizations, cultures, the complex patterns that emerge from organic intelligence. They feed on the entropy differential between order and chaos. Sarah stared at the displays, beginning to understand the true scope of what they faced.
And they see organic civilization as food. Precisely. Which is why conventional warfare has proven ineffective.
You can't fight something that exists partially outside normal spacetime using weapons that only function in normal spacetime. Synthesis manipulated the display, showing Sarah tactical analyses of previous engagements between galactic forces and convergence entities.
The results were uniformly catastrophic.
Entire fleets had simply vanished, leaving behind energy signatures that suggested they had been converted into raw information and absorbed. Every species that has faced them has followed predictable patterns, the Queen continued. They attempt to understand their enemy, develop counters based on observed behavior, deploy military assets in formations that follow established tactical doctrine. The convergence entities adapt to these patterns and neutralize them systematically.
But humans don't follow established patterns, Sarah said, beginning to see where this was leading.
Your species has a documented tendency toward what military analysts call beneficial irrationality. You make decisions that seem objectively wrong but prove effective because they confuse or disorient your opponents. Synthesis pulled up historical data from human conflicts, showing tactical decisions that had baffled alien military observers. The Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 soldiers held off an army of hundreds of thousands.
The Berlin airlift, where seemingly impossible logistics succeeded through sheer determination.
The Mars colony incident, where human settlers survived a total ecosystem collapse by improvising solutions that violated every established protocol.
Sarah studied the examples, seeing them now in a new light. You think human unpredictability can work against entities that exist outside normal space?
We think it's our only chance, Queen Lyralii said simply. They moved to another section of the Nexus, where Sarah saw something that made her stop in amazement. A group of humans were working at a station that seemed to be running combat simulations, but the scenarios were unlike anything she had ever seen. The participants were fighting enemies that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, using tactics that seemed to ignore basic principles of physics. Training for impossible warfare, the Queen explained.
We've had to develop entirely new approaches to combat, strategy, and even basic survival in environments that shouldn't exist.
One of the human trainees noticed their approach and jogged over. He was young, maybe in his 20s, with the kind of intense focus that Sarah associated with military special operations.
Dr. Chen?
I'm Marcus Webb, formerly of Earth's Marine Corps.
I've been here for 6 months, and I still don't fully understand what we're preparing for. None of us do, Sarah admitted. That seems to be the point. Marcus grinned. Exactly.
Traditional military training teaches you to analyze your enemy, understand their capabilities, predict their moves. Here, they're teaching us to fight things that our analysis says shouldn't be possible to fight.
Queen Lyralii gestured toward the training area. Would you like to observe a simulation? Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure she was prepared for what she might see.
The training area activated, and, suddenly, the space around them shifted. Sarah found herself standing in what appeared to be a region of space where the laws of physics were more like suggestions. Objects moved in directions that didn't exist, gravity flowed like liquid, and the trainees were engaging entities that seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. The key, Marcus explained as he watched his teammates work, is not to think about what's happening. The moment you try to analyze the situation logically, you freeze up.
You have to act on instinct and improvisation.
Sarah watched in fascination as the human trainees used tactics that made no rational sense but somehow proved effective. They attacked enemies by running away from them, defended positions by abandoning them, and communicated through methods that seemed to involve emotional states rather than words.
How do you learn to fight like that? You don't learn it, Marcus said. You unlearn everything else. The simulation ended, and normal space reasserted itself around them.
The trainees looked exhausted but exhilarated, comparing notes about encounters with entities that shouldn't have been possible to survive. Queen Lyralii led Sarah to a final station, where a lone human woman was working with equipment that seemed to be part computer, part organic growth, and part something else entirely. As they approached, Sarah realized the woman was communicating with the device through direct neural interface.
Dr. Chen, meet Dr. Elena Vasquez, formerly of the Interstellar Institute for Theoretical Physics. Elena has been developing our primary weapon against convergence entities.
Elena looked up, her eyes unfocused for a moment before snapping back to normal awareness.
Sorry, still interfacing with the quantum resonance matrix.
Takes a moment to remember how to think in baseline consciousness.
Quantum resonance matrix? Sarah asked.
It's not really quantum, and it doesn't actually resonate, Elena said with a tired smile. We just call it that because the real name would require mathematical concepts that don't exist in standard physics. Essentially, it's a device that allows human consciousness to interface directly with fold space. Sarah stared at the device, which seemed to pulse with its own internal light.
That should be impossible.
Everything about this war should be impossible, Elena replied.
Which is why conventional approaches don't work.
The convergence entities exist in spaces where our normal understanding of reality breaks down. To fight them, we need to be able to operate in those same spaces.
And human consciousness can do that? Better than any other known intelligence type.
Something about the way human brains process information makes us uniquely suited for fold space navigation. We think it has to do with your species' capacity for holding contradictory concepts simultaneously. Elena gestured to her workstation, which displayed readouts that seemed to shift meaning as Sarah looked at them. The device amplifies natural human cognitive flexibility, allowing direct interface with spaces that exist outside normal dimensional frameworks.
With it, a single human operator can engage convergence entities in their native environment. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. You're talking about sending humans into fold space to fight these things directly.
Not fight, exactly, Queen Lyralii said.
Something more complex.
The entities feed on organized information, but they also seem vulnerable to certain types of informational chaos. Human consciousness, when properly amplified, can create patterns of chaos that disrupt their feeding processes.
Elena nodded. Think of it as informational warfare.
We're not trying to destroy them physically, but to confuse their perception of reality to the point where they can't process organized information effectively.
And this actually works? We think so, Elena admitted.
We've had some success in limited trials, but we've never faced a full convergence incursion. The real test will come when they launch their primary offensive.
Queen Lyralii's expression grew grim.
Which, according to our intelligence, will happen within the next galactic standard month. The weight of that statement settled over Sarah like a physical force. Everything she had learned in the past few hours, all the impossible technology and incredible revelations, it was all leading up to a conflict that would begin within weeks.
What's my role in all this?
You'll be trained in fold space interface techniques, combat protocols that don't exist in any military manual, and, most importantly, how to coordinate human assets during actual engagement with convergence entities, the Queen explained. Your xenobiology background makes you uniquely qualified to understand how human cognitive patterns interface with non-baseline reality.
Sarah looked around the Nexus, seeing it now as something far more than a research facility.
It was a staging area for a type of warfare that had never been attempted before, using weapons that redefined what weapons could be.
When do we start? Elena stood up from her workstation, the neural interface cables retracting automatically. Right now. The first thing you need to learn is how to think in ways that your mind was never designed for.
As they moved toward a training area specifically configured for fold space interface protocols, Sarah realized that accepting this assignment meant fundamentally changing how she understood reality itself. The human brain wasn't designed for the kind of cognition required to survive in fold space, much less to fight entities that existed there. But, as she looked around at her fellow humans, Marcus with his military precision adapted to impossible tactics, Elena with her physics background turned toward redefining the nature of existence itself, and dozens of others from every field of human knowledge, she began to understand what made them uniquely suited for this challenge. Other species followed logical patterns, even in their adaptations. Humans seemed capable of reinventing themselves completely when circumstances required it. They could hold contradictory ideas simultaneously, operate effectively in situations they didn't understand, and, most importantly, they could make decisions that seemed objectively wrong but proved strategically brilliant. Dr. Chen, Queen Lyralii said as they reached the training area, "Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Knowing what you know now, understanding the true scope of what we face and what we're asking you to risk, are you certain you want to proceed?" Sarah thought of Earth, dying and forgotten. She thought of humanity scattered across the galaxy as second-class citizens. She thought of the convergence entities, feeding on organized information and treating organic civilization as nothing more than complex food. "Yes," she said. "Let's save the galaxy." As the training equipment activated around her and her consciousness began to touch the edges of fold space for the first time, Sarah realized that her new life as a maid was about to become far more challenging than anything she had ever imagined. But, for the first time since leaving Earth, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The first time Sarah's consciousness touched fold space, she understood why previous species had failed so completely against the convergence entities. The experience was like trying to breathe underwater while simultaneously solving complex mathematics in a language that changed its rules every few seconds. Normal minds would have snapped under the strain within moments. But, somehow, her human brain adapted. Not gracefully, not easily, but with the stubborn flexibility that seemed to define her species. Where other intelligences would have tried to impose logical structure on the chaos of fold space, Sarah found herself embracing the contradiction and using it as a navigation tool. "Remarkable," Dr. Vasquez murmured as she monitored Sarah's vital signs from her workstation. "Your neural patterns are stabilizing faster than any previous subject. Most trainees take weeks to achieve basic fold space awareness." Sarah couldn't respond verbally while interfaced with the quantum resonance matrix, but she was beginning to understand why humans might have an advantage in this impossible environment. Fold space wasn't chaotic, it operated according to rules that were simply too complex and contradictory for logical analysis. Human intuition, the ability to feel correct answers without understanding how they were derived, seemed perfectly suited for navigation here. Through her expanded consciousness, she began to perceive the convergence entities themselves. They were vast beyond comprehension, existing as networks of organized information that spanned multiple dimensional frameworks. Each entity was like a living galaxy, composed of countless smaller intelligences that functioned as neurons in an impossibly large brain. But they were also predictable in ways that surprised her. For all their size and complexity, they followed patterns that were rigid and unchanging. They consumed organized information in systematic ways, processed data according to algorithms that had remained constant for millions of years, and responded to threats using strategies that had been effective against every previous enemy they had encountered. "They're not really intelligent," Sarah realized as her awareness touched the edges of a smaller convergence entity. "They're more like biological computers running the same programs they've always run." "That's the insight that changed everything for us," Queen Lyralii's voice reached her through the interface. "They appear intelligent because of their size and complexity, but they're actually quite limited in their thinking. They've never needed to adapt because nothing has ever successfully challenged their feeding patterns." Sarah's consciousness explored deeper into fold space, learning to navigate dimensions where cause and effect operated in reverse, where objects could exist in multiple states simultaneously, and where the basic concepts of space and time became fluid and malleable. The experience should have been terrifying, but instead she found it oddly liberating. In normal space, human thinking was constrained by physics, logic, and the need to maintain consistency. In fold space, those limitations disappeared. She could hold contradictory ideas simultaneously without cognitive dissonance, pursue multiple lines of reasoning that led to mutually exclusive conclusions, and make decisions based on criteria that didn't need to make rational sense.
This is what other species can't do, she understood. They need their reality to be consistent.
We're comfortable with contradictions. When the interface session ended and her consciousness snapped back to normal space, Sarah felt like she had been away for hours. According to the monitoring equipment, only 17 minutes had passed.
How do you feel? Elena asked, studying the readouts with intense interest. Sarah considered the question carefully. Different. Like I've remembered something I never knew I'd forgotten.
That's the typical human response, Marcus said from nearby. Every other species we've tested either goes catatonic or starts screaming.
Humans just adapt.
Over the following weeks, Sarah's training intensified in ways that redefined her understanding of what training could be.
Combat instruction involved learning to fight enemies that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously.
Strategy sessions required developing battle plans for scenarios where traditional concepts of space, time, and causality didn't apply. And, throughout it all, she maintained her cover as domestic staff, cleaning rooms and organizing closets while secretly preparing for a war that would determine the fate of galactic civilization. The dichotomy was surreal. In the morning, she would dust Queen Lyrelia's furniture and organize her wardrobes, performing the mundane tasks of a servant with careful attention to detail. In the afternoon, she would descend to the Nexus and train with weapons that existed in multiple dimensions, learning to coordinate attacks across fold space against entities that could remake reality with their thoughts. The cover identity isn't just for secrecy, Queen Lyrelia explained during one of their strategy sessions.
It's also psychological conditioning.
The ability to switch between mundane reality and impossible warfare without losing your sanity is itself a weapon against the convergence entities.
How so?
They exist in a state of constant high-level cognition. Every thought, every action, every decision involves processing information across multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously. They can't understand minds that operate on simple, immediate concerns.
Sarah was learning that human psychology was more alien to the galaxy than she had ever realized.
The capacity to focus intently on immediate, practical concerns while simultaneously maintaining awareness of vast, abstract concepts was apparently unique to her species. Other intelligences either operated on a consistently high level of complexity or remained focused on immediate survival needs. We can think about cleaning bathrooms and saving the galaxy at the same time, she said with sudden insight.
And both concerns feel equally real to us.
Exactly. That cognitive flexibility is what makes human consciousness able to interface with fold space without losing coherence. As her training progressed, Sarah began working with actual convergence entity remnants, fragments of information patterns that had been captured during previous encounters. These fragments existed in specialized containment fields that allowed safe study while maintaining the entity's essential characteristics.
Think of them as biological viruses, Elena explained as they prepared for Sarah's first direct contact with convergence intelligence. They're not truly alive, but they carry the essential patterns of entity cognition. If you can learn to disrupt these fragments, you'll be able to affect full entities during actual combat.
The containment chamber was a sphere of crystalline material suspended in a framework of energy fields that hurt to look at directly. Inside the sphere, something moved that wasn't quite light and wasn't quite matter. It pulsed with patterns that seemed almost familiar, as if Sarah's brain was trying to recognize something it had never seen before. "I'm going to establish interface contact," Sarah announced, settling into the neural link chair. "Monitor my patterns for signs of entity infiltration." As her consciousness expanded into fold space, the entity fragment immediately detected her presence. The response was instantaneous and overwhelming, a flood of organized information that tried to categorize her mind, analyze her cognitive patterns, and integrate her consciousness into its own framework. This was how the convergence entities normally dealt with organic intelligence. They absorbed it, processed it, and used it to enhance their own understanding. Previous attempts at direct contact had resulted in the complete assimilation of the test subject's consciousness within seconds. But Sarah's mind refused to be organized according to the entity's parameters. Where it expected logical structures, it found contradiction. Where it looked for consistent patterns, it encountered chaos that somehow remained functional. Her human consciousness slipped through its analysis like water through a net. More importantly, she found that her presence was disruptive to the entity's own patterns. Her chaotic thought processes introduced noise into its information systems, creating errors that propagated through its network architecture. The more it tried to understand her, the more its own coherence degraded.
I can feel it getting confused, Sarah reported through the neural link. It's trying to process my thoughts, but they don't fit its categories. Can you push the disruption further? Elena asked.
Sarah focused on embracing the contradictions in her thinking, deliberately holding multiple incompatible ideas simultaneously while maintaining full conviction in each of them. She thought about being a maid while being a warrior, about serving a queen while planning revolution, about following orders while making autonomous decisions.
The entity fragment recoiled as if struck.
Its patterns began to fluctuate wildly, its organized information structures dissolving into static. Within minutes, the containment sphere went dark as the fragment lost coherence entirely.
Successful disruption achieved, Elena announced with satisfaction.
The fragment has been neutralized without any signs of consciousness absorption or infiltration. Sarah disconnected from the neural link, her head spinning with the aftereffects of fold space contact.
It couldn't handle the paradoxes. Its entire cognitive structure is based on logical consistency.
Which means we have a weapon they can't counter, Queen Lyralii said with grim satisfaction. They've developed defenses against every form of attack they've previously encountered, but they can't defend against something that works by being contradictory. As the weeks of training continued, Sarah began to understand the true scope of Operation Mindbreak. Human agents were being deployed throughout the galaxy, most of them unaware of their true purpose. They worked as traders, diplomats, researchers, and laborers, but all of them carried neural implants that would activate during a convergence incursion. When the entities attack, Queen Lyralii explained during a briefing session, they'll encounter pockets of chaotic human consciousness spread across thousands of systems.
Each activation will create informational disruption that spreads through their network structures. How many agents are we talking about?
17,000 confirmed, with another 30,000 in preliminary training phases. Not all of them know what they're being prepared for.
Sarah thought about the ethical implications of that. You're turning humans into weapons without their knowledge?
We're giving humans the tools to defend themselves against an enemy that sees them as food, the Queen replied firmly. The choice to use those tools will always be theirs to make.
The distinction felt important, though Sarah wasn't entirely convinced by it.
The neural implants would activate automatically during convergence contact, meaning the humans carrying them would find themselves in fold space combat whether they wanted to be or not. But, as reports continued to arrive from the outer systems, where advanced convergence scouts were beginning to probe galactic defenses, Sarah realized that ethical concerns might be a luxury they couldn't afford. Entire civilizations were simply vanishing, consumed by entities that absorbed their organized information and left behind empty space where thriving worlds had existed. The Altarian Republic lost its entire research fleet last week, Marcus reported during a tactical briefing.
12,000 beings, including some of the galaxy's most advanced scientists, converted to raw information in less than an hour.
And, the Hive Collective has gone silent in 3 systems along the galactic rim, Elena added. No distress signals, no final transmissions, just complete information absorption. Sarah studied the tactical displays, seeing the pattern of convergence expansion for the first time from a strategic perspective.
They're not just feeding randomly. They're targeting centers of organized information, universities, research facilities, cultural archives. They're preparing the galaxy for full conversion, Queen Lyralii confirmed.
Every major source of complex information is being systematically absorbed. When the primary offensive begins, they'll have already consumed most of our knowledge base.
How long until the primary offensive? Based on current patterns, we estimate 6 standard days. The timeline hit Sarah like a physical blow.
After weeks of training and preparation, the actual war was about to begin within less than a week. Everything they had learned, all the impossible weapons and contradictory tactics, would soon be tested against enemies that had never been successfully challenged.
Are we ready? Queen Lyralii's expression was unreadable.
We're as ready as anyone can be for a war that's never been fought before, using weapons that shouldn't exist, against enemies that operate outside normal reality.
That's not really an answer. Because there isn't a real answer.
We're about to find out whether human consciousness can save galactic civilization or whether the convergence entities will add us to their information stores along with everyone else. That night, as Sarah performed her duties in the Queen's chambers, dusting furniture and organizing personal effects while her mind processed tactical scenarios for impossible warfare, she realized that her double life had become something more than just cover for a secret mission. The ability to exist simultaneously as a humble servant and a specialized warrior was itself the weapon they were counting on. The Queen found her in the garden chamber, where bioluminescent organisms created patterns of light that reminded Sarah of the fold space geometry she had learned to navigate.
Having doubts? Queen Lyralii asked. About the mission? No. About whether we're the good guys in this situation? That's more complicated. How so? Sarah gestured to the living light patterns around them. We're turning humans into weapons without their knowledge. We're preparing to fight a war using tactics that could fundamentally change how consciousness itself works. And we're doing it all based on the assumption that preserving organic civilization is worth any cost. Do you disagree with that assumption?
Sarah thought about Earth, slowly dying as humanity scattered to the stars. She thought about her fellow humans working throughout the galaxy as laborers and servants, not because they chose those roles but because they were the only opportunities available to them. She thought about civilizations that had existed for millions of years, now being systematically absorbed by entities that saw them only as information to be processed. No, she said finally.
I don't disagree. But I want to be honest about what we're becoming in order to fight them. Queen Lyralii nodded approvingly. That awareness may be what makes the difference.
The convergence entities have never had to question their own methods or consider the cost of their actions.
They simply consume and process without reflection.
And we're choosing to become something new in order to stop them.
Exactly.
The question is whether we can win this war without losing ourselves in the process. As Sarah looked around the chamber that served as both royal residence and command center, she realized that the answer to that question would depend on whether humanity could maintain its essential contradictions even while wielding them as weapons. They had to become warriors while remaining servants, fighters while staying peaceful, weapons while preserving their humanity. The convergence war was about to begin, and the fate of galactic civilization would depend on whether one species could remain paradoxical enough to defeat enemies that had consumed reality itself. The convergence assault began not with explosions or energy weapons, but with silence. Star systems simply stopped transmitting. Communication networks across the galactic rim went dark in sequential patterns that painted a clear picture of methodical consumption. Sarah watched the tactical displays in the Nexus as entire civilizations winked out of existence, their organized information absorbed by entities that treated billion-year-old cultures as nothing more than data to be processed. 17 systems down in the past hour, Marcus reported from his monitoring station.
The pattern suggests they're moving toward core worlds along established trade routes.
Sarah studied the progression, her xenobiological training helping her see the underlying logic.
They're not just consuming randomly.
They're following information density gradients, targeting systems with the most complex organized data structures first. Queen Lyralii stood at the central command interface, her metallic skin reflecting the light from dozens of holographic displays. Which means they'll reach major population centers within days.
The time for preparation has ended.
Elena looked up from her workstation, where she had been monitoring fold space energy fluctuations. I'm detecting massive dimensional distortions moving through normal space.
The entities are bringing fold space with them as they advance.
Explain, Sarah said, though she was beginning to understand the implications.
They're not just existing in fold space anymore.
They're projecting it into normal reality, creating zones where the laws of physics become fluid. Any conventional forces that enter those zones will find their weapons, their ships, and their very understanding of reality compromised.
Sarah felt a chill of understanding.
The convergence entities weren't just superior opponents, they were rewriting the fundamental rules of engagement. In a universe where causality could flow backward and objects could exist in multiple states simultaneously, traditional military tactics became meaningless. But humans can operate in those conditions, she said with sudden certainty.
That's what we're counting on, Queen Lyralii replied.
Operation Mindbreak activation begins in 3 hours.
Every human agent in the galaxy will receive their neural implant activation sequences simultaneously.
The weight of that statement settled over the Nexus like a physical force. 17,000 humans, most of them unaware they carried weapons in their minds, would suddenly find themselves on the front lines of a war that redefined what war could be.
What about the ones who don't know what they're carrying? Sarah asked. They'll receive emergency briefing transmissions along with their activation sequences.
It's not ideal, but there wasn't time for full preparation. Sarah thought about the human traders, diplomats, researchers, and laborers scattered across the galaxy who were about to discover they were humanity's secret weapons against an impossible enemy.
The psychological shock alone could be devastating. Some of them won't survive the activation, she said quietly.
Some of them won't survive the convergence assault if we don't activate them, Elena replied with clinical detachment.
The entities absorb human consciousness just as easily as any other organized information. At least this way they have a chance to fight back.
The moral calculus was brutal but undeniable. Sarah was beginning to understand that everything about this war required choices that redefined the nature of choice itself. An alarm chimed through the Nexus as new data flooded the displays. The convergence advance had accelerated dramatically, with multiple entity groups converging on a single target system.
Zephyr Prime, Queen Lyralii announced with grim finality. They're coming here. Sarah stared at the tactical readouts, seeing the massive dimensional distortions approaching their location. How long? 18 hours until full space projection reaches our outer system boundaries.
6 hours after that until they achieve planetary orbit.
And our defenses?
Conventional defenses are useless against entities that exist partially outside normal spacetime, Marcus said from his station.
The entire Zephyrian fleet couldn't scratch them.
Queen Lyralii gestured, and the display shifted to show deployment patterns for human agents throughout the system.
But 317 human assets are positioned throughout Zephyr Prime and its orbital facilities.
When the entities arrive, they'll encounter the first coordinated human consciousness assault in galactic history.
Sarah studied the deployment patterns, noting how the human agents were distributed.
You've been planning this specific engagement for months. Years, the Queen corrected.
Zephyr Prime was always going to be either our greatest victory or our final defeat. The palace contains enough organized information to sustain a major convergence entity for decades. If we can successfully defend this system, we prove human weapons are effective. If we fail, the galaxy falls, Sarah finished. Eventually, yes.
Other systems might hold out for a while, but, without proof that the entities can be defeated, galactic civilization will collapse into chaos and despair.
Elena stood up from her workstation, neural interface cables retracting automatically.
I need to begin final preparations for the planetary defense matrix. Sarah, you'll be interfacing with the primary weapon system during the assault.
What primary weapon system?
The palace itself, Queen Lyralii explained.
The entire structure has been modified to function as a massive neural interface array.
During the assault, every human in the building will be linked through a shared consciousness network that amplifies our natural fold space capabilities.
Sarah felt a jolt of understanding mixed with terror.
You're talking about merging human consciousness on a planetary scale.
Not merging, networking.
Each individual consciousness remains distinct, but they can coordinate their actions across multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously. It's the only way to match the scale of what we're facing.
The implications were staggering. Sarah had experienced the disorienting effects of individual fold space interface.
The idea of coordinating hundreds of human minds across impossible dimensions suggested possibilities that were both exhilarating and terrifying.
Have you tested this networking concept? Small-scale trials only. You'll be part of the first large-scale deployment. And if it doesn't work? Queen Lyreliai's expression was unreadable. Then, we discover whether human consciousness can survive complete information absorption by convergence entities. The next few hours passed in a blur of final preparations. Sarah found herself alternating between her covered duties as domestic staff and her real work preparing for impossible warfare. She organized the Queen's library while running combat diagnostics on neural interface systems. She cleaned windows while reviewing tactical protocols for multi-dimensional engagement. She prepared meals while studying the psychological profiles of convergence entities. The dichotomy had become second nature to her, but she was beginning to understand that it was more than just operational security. The ability to exist simultaneously in multiple roles, to hold contradictory purposes without losing coherence, was itself preparation for what they were about to attempt. The entities can't understand minds that operate on multiple levels simultaneously, she realized during a brief conversation with Marcus as they tested communication protocols. They analyze consciousness by looking for consistent patterns, but human minds are consistently inconsistent. That's the theory we're betting our lives on, Marcus replied. The question is whether we can maintain that inconsistency while coordinating attacks across hundreds of individual consciousness. As the convergence assault force approached Zephyr Prime's outer system, Sarah could feel changes in the fabric of reality itself. The air seemed to shimmer with possibilities, and she occasionally glimpsed architectural features that couldn't exist in normal space. The palace was beginning to exist partially in fold space, preparing for the dimensional warfare to come. Entity projection detected, announced one of the monitoring technicians. Fold space distortions are beginning to affect normal matter throughout the outer system. Queen Lyreliai activated the central command interface, and, suddenly, every surface in the Nexus displayed tactical information. All human agents, prepare for neural interface activation. Operation Mindbreak is now live. Sarah felt her own neural implant warming as it came online, connecting her consciousness to the expanding network of human minds throughout the system. The sensation was unlike anything she had experienced before. Suddenly, she was aware of hundreds of other perspectives, each one distinct but somehow harmonized with her own thoughts. Through the network, she could feel the convergence entities approaching. They were vast beyond comprehension, networks of organized information that spanned dimensional frameworks like living galaxies. As they moved through space, they projected zones of altered reality where the normal laws of physics became fluid and unpredictable. Contact in 30 minutes, Elena announced, her voice carrying through both normal communication systems and the neural network simultaneously. Sarah found herself at the primary interface station, neural cables connecting her directly to the palace's enhanced systems. Through the interface, she could perceive the entire Zephyr system as a complex information matrix, with each human agent appearing as a node of chaotic potential in an otherwise ordered landscape. They're beautiful, she realized with sudden shock, watching the convergence entities approach through fold space perception. And terrifying. The entities moved like living art, their information patterns creating displays of impossible complexity and elegance. They were intelligence on a scale that dwarfed individual consciousness, thinking thoughts that spanned galactic distances and processing data that encompassed the complete history of civilizations. But they were also predators, and Sarah could feel their hunger as they detected the organized information concentrated in Zephyr Prime. To them, the planet appeared as a feast of complex data structures waiting to be consumed and processed. Entity contact in 5 minutes, Marcus reported. All agents report ready status. Through the neural network, Sarah could feel the tension and fear of her fellow humans, but also their determination. Most of them still didn't fully understand what they were about to attempt, but they were willing to trust in methods they couldn't comprehend to fight enemies they couldn't imagine. Remember, Queen Lyreliai transmitted through the network, don't try to think like them. Don't try to understand them. Just be human, and let your consciousness do what human consciousness does naturally. Sarah watched through enhanced perception as the first convergence entity entered Zephyr Prime's gravitational influence. Immediately, space around the entity began to behave strangely. Gravity flowed in spirals, light bent at impossible angles, and the planet's orbital mechanics started to become erratic. Fold space projection is affecting the entire system, Elena reported. Normal physics are beginning to break down throughout local space.
Then, it's time to stop being normal, Sarah said, and activated the planetary consciousness network. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. Suddenly, Sarah's mind was connected to every human in the system, their thoughts and perceptions flowing together in a symphony of chaotic consciousness that somehow maintained perfect harmony. Through hundreds of pairs of eyes, she could see the convergence entity from every angle simultaneously. More importantly, she could feel the entity's confusion as it encountered the human network. Where it expected to find individual consciousness that could be analyzed and absorbed, it instead found a collective that remained paradoxically individual. The humans were working together while maintaining their separate identities, coordinating their actions while following contradictory impulses.
It doesn't know how to process us, Sarah transmitted through the network. We're too inconsistent for its analysis protocols.
Then, let's give it something really confusing, Marcus replied, and launched the first human assault into foldspace.
The attack was unlike anything that had ever been attempted in galactic history. 300 human consciousness, networked but distinct, projected themselves into the dimensional framework where the convergence entity existed. They brought with them all the contradictions, paradoxes, and inconsistencies that define human thinking. The entity recoiled as if struck by a physical blow. Its information patterns began to fluctuate as it tried to process the assault, but human consciousness refused to conform to its analysis parameters. Where it looked for logic, it found inspiration. Where it expected consistency, it encountered creativity.
Where it sought patterns, it discovered improvisation.
We're disrupting its cognitive coherence, Sarah reported, feeling the entity's confusion through her foldspace interface.
It can't maintain stable thought patterns while processing our consciousness. But the entity was learning, adapting its responses to counter the human assault.
It began to isolate individual human consciousness, trying to analyze them separately rather than as a collective. It's targeting isolated agents, Elena warned. We need to maintain network coherence or it will pick us off one by one.
Sarah felt several human consciousness beginning to waver as the entity focused its analysis on them. The strain of maintaining foldspace awareness while under direct scrutiny from a galactic-scale intelligence was enormous.
Hold formation, she transmitted through the network. Remember what makes us human, we don't have to make sense to be effective.
The battle raged across multiple dimensions as human consciousness clashed with convergence intelligence in spaces where thought and reality were indistinguishable. Sarah found herself coordinating attacks that involved pursuing multiple contradictory strategies simultaneously, defending positions by abandoning them, and communicating through methods that bypassed language entirely. And, slowly, impossibly, they began to win. The convergence entity's information patterns grew increasingly unstable as it struggled to process the sustained assault of human consciousness.
Its feeding mechanisms, designed to absorb organized information, couldn't handle data that remained organized while being fundamentally chaotic. It's losing coherence, Sarah announced with growing excitement. The contradictions are spreading through its neural networks faster than it can adapt.
Within hours, the first convergence entity in galactic history had been forced to retreat, its consciousness too disrupted to maintain its assault on the system. But, as Sarah disconnected from the neural network and normal awareness returned, she realized that their victory had come at a cost that was only beginning to become apparent. Every human who had participated in the assault had been fundamentally changed by the experience of networked consciousness across foldspace. They had won the first battle, but the war was far from over. And the question now was whether humanity could remain human while wielding weapons that redefined the nature of consciousness itself. The aftermath of the first convergence retreat should have been a moment of celebration, but Sarah found herself sitting in Queen Lyreliai's garden chamber, staring at her hands as if she had never seen them before. The neural network had been disconnected for 6 hours, but she could still feel echoes of the other consciousness that had merged with hers during the assault.
The psychological effects were expected, Dr. Vasquez said as she reviewed Sarah's post-battle medical scans. Extended foldspace consciousness interface, especially in a networked configuration, fundamentally alters neural pathway structures. I can still think their thoughts, Sarah said quietly.
Marcus, Elena, the other agents, pieces of their consciousness are still active in my mind. Queen Lyreliai approached, her expression grave.
This is why we were reluctant to deploy large-scale networking.
The boundaries between individual human consciousness become fluid during extended interface periods. Sarah looked up at the Queen, seeing her now with perceptions that belonged to 17 different people simultaneously.
We won, but we're not the same people who started the fight.
That may be what victory requires, the Queen replied. The convergence entities adapt to any strategy they encounter long enough to analyze. Remaining effective against them may require continuously evolving beyond their ability to predict. Reports were flooding in from across the galaxy as news of the successful defense spread through diplomatic and military channels. For the first time in 3 centuries of sporadic contact with convergence entities, an organic civilization had not only survived an assault but actually forced a retreat. The psychological impact on other species has been enormous, Marcus reported during an emergency briefing session.
The Altarian Republic is requesting immediate consultation on human consciousness integration protocols. The Hive Collective wants to purchase licensing rights for fold-space interface technology.
Even the usually isolationist Silicon Confederacy has opened diplomatic channels. Sarah studied the intelligence reports with her enhanced perception, seeing patterns that would have been invisible to her original consciousness.
They think we've developed a weapon they can use. But they can't, Elena said with certainty. We've run analysis on non-human neural architecture.
No other species has the cognitive flexibility necessary for stable fold-space interface. Their consciousness structures are too organized, too logical. So humanity becomes the galaxy's weapon against the convergence, Sarah realized.
Whether we want to or not. Queen Lyralii activated a new set of displays showing strategic projections for the war's continuation.
The entity that retreated from Zephyr Prime has rejoined the main convergence force. Our intelligence suggests they're adapting their approach based on what they learned here.
How so? They're targeting isolated human populations throughout the galaxy. If they can prevent us from achieving the critical mass necessary for effective networking, they can neutralize our advantages before we can deploy them strategically. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. They're going to hunt down every human in the galaxy. Not just humans, Marcus added grimly. They've begun targeting any species that might potentially develop fold-space capabilities.
The Zephyrian Empire has received reports of systematic attacks on research facilities, universities, and cultural centers throughout the galaxy. The scope of the conflict was expanding beyond anything they had anticipated. What had begun as a desperate defense of Zephyr Prime was becoming a galaxy-wide war between organized information and chaotic consciousness.
We need to accelerate deployment of human assets, Elena said.
Every day we delay, more potential agents are lost to entity absorption.
But rapid deployment means inadequate training, Sarah pointed out.
The humans we're activating won't understand what they're being asked to do or why their consciousness is suddenly capable of impossible things.
Queen Lyralii's expression was troubled.
The alternative is allowing the convergence entities to systematically eliminate humanity's ability to resist them. Sarah thought of the humans scattered across the galaxy, refugees, laborers, traders, and researchers who had left dying Earth seeking better lives among the stars. They had no idea they carried the genetic and psychological heritage that made them uniquely capable of resisting forces that had consumed civilizations spanning millions of years.
There's something else we need to consider, Sarah said, accessing data through her enhanced neural pathways. The networking effect isn't limited to combat applications.
If we can coordinate human consciousness across galactic distances, we can share knowledge, experiences, and capabilities in ways that have never been possible before.
Elena looked up from her workstation, interested. Explain.
I can access Marcus's military training even though I've never served in combat. He can draw on my xenobiological expertise even though he's never studied alien life forms. The network doesn't just coordinate our actions, it makes all human knowledge available to any human consciousness connected to the network.
The implications were staggering.
A galaxy-wide human consciousness network would create a collective intelligence that maintained individual identity while sharing unlimited access to human knowledge and experience. But there are risks, Queen Lyralii warned.
Extended networking can result in personality integration. Individual consciousness can be overwhelmed by the collective.
Or it can be enhanced by it, Sarah countered. I'm not losing myself in the network, I'm becoming more myself by understanding what humanity as a whole is capable of. Over the following days, as reports continued to arrive of convergence advances and strategic retreats, Sarah found herself at the center of expanding efforts to understand the full potential of human consciousness networking. What had begun as a weapon against impossible enemies was evolving into something that could transform not just warfare but the very nature of human civilization. We're not just fighting for survival anymore, she realized during a strategy session with the Queen and her advisors. We're discovering what humanity can become when our individual limitations are transcended without losing our individual nature.
Is that a good thing or a dangerous thing? Marcus asked.
Both, Sarah replied.
Like everything else about this war.
New intelligence arrived that changed everything they thought they understood about the conflict. Dr. Vasquez burst into the strategy chamber with data that shouldn't have been possible to collect. We've been thinking about this war all wrong, Elena announced, her face flushed with excitement and terror.
The convergence entities aren't just feeding on organized information, they're trying to become something new.
Sarah studied the readings Elena had brought, her enhanced consciousness allowing her to process data that would have been incomprehensible to her original mind. These patterns, they're not just consumption algorithms.
They're transformation protocols.
The entities are attempting to evolve beyond their current state, Queen Lyralii said with dawning understanding. They're consuming organized information not just for sustenance, but to achieve a higher form of existence.
And human consciousness disrupts the transformation process, Sarah realized. Our chaotic patterns introduce errors into their evolution algorithms. Elena nodded grimly. Which means this war isn't about territory or resources or survival.
It's about two completely different approaches to the evolution of intelligence itself.
Sarah felt the weight of that revelation settle over her enhanced awareness.
They want to become perfectly organized, supremely logical, ultimately predictable intelligence.
We represent the opposite, intelligence that thrives on contradiction, paradox, and uncertainty.
And only one approach can ultimately survive, Marcus said quietly. The next phase of the war began not with massive fleet engagements or planetary assaults, but with something far more subtle and dangerous. Convergence entities began appearing in systems throughout the galaxy not to consume information, but to project organized consciousness patterns that attempted to impose logical structures on chaotic minds.
They're trying to convert us, Sarah reported during an emergency session as reports flooded in from human assets across the galaxy.
Rather than absorbing human consciousness, they're attempting to reorganize it according to their own patterns.
Can they succeed? Queen Lyralii asked. Sarah accessed the collective knowledge of every human connected to the network, drawing on expertise from dozens of specialists.
Some humans are vulnerable to consciousness reorganization, especially those who haven't developed resistance through fold space exposure. But the process works both ways. While they're trying to organize us, we're introducing chaos into their patterns. So this becomes a war of mutual conversion, Elena said with grim understanding.
Except we have an advantage they don't, Sarah realized.
Human consciousness can exist in organized and chaotic states simultaneously. We can let them partially convert us while maintaining our essential randomness. Marcus stared at her.
That sounds incredibly dangerous.
Everything about this war is incredibly dangerous, Sarah replied. But it might be our path to victory. The final strategy they developed was both elegant and terrifying.
Rather than resisting convergence conversion attempts, selected human agents would allow partial reorganization of their consciousness while maintaining hidden cores of chaotic thinking.
They would become double agents within the convergence network, appearing to be successfully converted while actually introducing systematic errors into entity cognitive processes.
It requires volunteers who are willing to risk complete personality dissolution, Queen Lyralii warned as they prepared for deployment.
If the disguise fails, the agent's consciousness will be absorbed entirely.
But if it succeeds, we can disrupt the convergence transformation process from within, Sarah countered. We can turn their own evolution against them.
The volunteers came from across human space, individuals who understood that their species had become the galaxy's best hope against an enemy that threatened the very nature of organic intelligence. They were traders who had spent years adapting to alien cultures, researchers who had learned to think in multiple paradigms simultaneously, and refugees who had already lost everything and had nothing left to lose except the war itself. Sarah found herself chosen to lead the infiltration mission, her unique combination of xenobiological expertise and fold-space combat experience making her the logical choice for attempting something that redefined logic itself. Remember, Queen Lyrelii said as Sarah prepared for neural interface with the Modified Consciousness Network, "You're not just representing humanity in this mission. You're representing the principle that intelligence can remain free, chaotic, and unpredictable even in the face of forces that seek to organize everything according to rigid patterns." As Sarah's consciousness expanded into foldspace for what might be the final time, she carried with her the hopes and fears of every human in the galaxy, the accumulated knowledge and experience of her entire species, and the terrible responsibility of determining whether organic intelligence would remain free to grow and change in unpredictable ways. The convergence entities detected her approach and immediately began conversion protocols, attempting to reorganize her consciousness according to their logical frameworks. Sarah allowed the process to begin while maintaining hidden cores of chaotic thinking that the entities couldn't detect. For the first time in their existence, the convergence entities believed they had successfully converted a human consciousness to their organized patterns. They welcomed her into their collective intelligence, sharing their transformation goals and integration protocols without realizing that every piece of information they shared with her was being subtly corrupted by her hidden humanity. Months passed as Sarah worked within the convergence network, introducing microscopic errors into their evolution algorithms while appearing to function as a perfectly organized component of their collective intelligence. The other human infiltrators did the same throughout the galaxy, creating a network of chaos within the entity's ordered consciousness. When the convergence entities finally attempted their ultimate transformation, the conversion of all organic intelligence in the galaxy into a single, perfectly organized superconsciousness, the accumulated errors introduced by human infiltrators caused the entire process to collapse into paradox. The entities found themselves trapped in logical loops that had no resolution, attempting to process contradictions that their organized consciousness couldn't handle. Their perfect order dissolved into chaos that they couldn't adapt to because chaos was antithetical to their very nature. Sarah emerged from the collapsed convergence network to find a galaxy transformed. Humanity had not only saved organic civilization but had demonstrated that intelligence could remain free and unpredictable even when facing forces that seemed infinitely superior. As she stood once again in Queen Lyrelii's garden chamber, watching bioluminescent patterns that now reminded her of the infinite possibilities of conscious existence, Sarah realized that her mission as a maid had become something far more significant than anyone had originally planned. She had helped save the galaxy not by being a perfect weapon, but by remaining imperfectly, chaotically, paradoxically human. And, in doing so, she had proven that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe was not perfect organization, but the beautiful, terrible, wonderful chaos of minds that refused to be anything other than free.